There is a photograph that circulates in certain corners of the internet. A wide cobblestone avenue, somewhere in Europe, sometime in the late 1800s. Down the centre of the street stands a row of tall iron poles, and at the top of each one sits a strange glowing tube. The light it throws is pale and cold, almost blue, the colour of a face that has stopped breathing. People who share this image will tell you that you are looking at a lost technology, a street lamp that needed no wires, no coal, no gas. A lamp that pulled its energy out of the air itself and burned for free, until someone with money decided that free light was bad for business. It is a beautiful story. And almost none of it is true. But here is the part that should bother you. The real story, the one with the actual dates and the actual men and the actual money, is stranger than the myth. Cities really did light themselves with artificial suns bright enough to hurt your eyes from a block away. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Engineers really did build towers taller than churches just to hold lamps. There really was a corpse blue lamp full of mercury that made everyone underneath it look like they were already dead. And these technologies really were ripped out of the ground again and again and replaced, not because they failed, but because of money, patents, and a war between two of the most ruthless men in American industry. So forget the free energy fantasy for a moment. The truth is better. Let me show you what actually happened to the light. To understand why the streets of the 1800s were so desperate for a better lamp, you have to understand how dark the world used to be. For almost the entire history of the human race, when the sun went down, civilization more or less shut off. A city at night was a dangerous place. Footpads and thieves owned the shadows. Respectable people stayed indoors. If you absolutely had to go out, you carried a lantern, or you paid a boy called a link boy to walk ahead of you carrying a torch of burning pitch, and you prayed he was not leading you straight into an ambush. The first real attempt to push back the darkness on a city scale came from gas. In the early 1800s, London began running pipes under its streets carrying coal gas, and at the top of cast iron poles, they fitted burners that could be lit each evening by a man with a long pole. Pall Mall got its gas lamps in 1807. Within a few decades, the technology spread across the great cities of the world. It felt like magic. For the first time, a street could glow from end to end without anyone holding a flame, but gaslight was a compromise and everyone knew it. The flame was dim and yellow, barely a smudge of orange in the fog. It flickered, it hissed, it leaked, and the leaks killed people in their sleep and blew up the occasional building. Every single lamp had to be lit by hand at dusk and put out by hand at dawn, which meant an army of lamplighters walking the same routes every night of their lives. And the gas itself was filthy, leaving a greasy residue on the glass and a sulphurous stink in the air, so when the first electric lights appeared, they did not look like an improvement. They looked like the arrival of something from another world. The science behind that new light was actually old. Back around 1808, an English chemist named Humphrey Davy connected two rods of carbon to an enormous battery, a bank of 2,000 cells, and brought the tips close together. A blinding arc of electricity leapt across the gap, a sustained spark so bright it was painful to look at. This was the electric arc. Davy had proven, decades early, that electricity could make light brighter than anything humanity had ever produced on purpose. The problem was that nobody could power it. Davy's arc ate through that giant battery in minutes. There was no practical way to generate enough continuous electricity to keep an arc burning for hours, night after night. So for most of the 1800s, the electric arc stayed in the laboratory, a beautiful and useless curiosity. What changed everything was the dynamo, the steam-powered electric generator. Once engineers could spin a machine and produce a steady, powerful current cheaply, the arc light suddenly became possible at scale. And the man who first turned that possibility into a spectacle was a Russian named Pavel Yablochkov. In 1876, Yablochkov invented something he called an electric candle. It was a clever trick. Instead of trying to constantly push two carbon rods toward each other as they burned, he stood them side by side, separated by a thin strip of insulating clay, and let them burn down together like a wax candle. It was simple, and it worked. In 1878, the city of Paris strung these Yablochkov candles along the Avenue de l'Opéra and other grand boulevards, and the effect was staggering. Parisians came out at night just to stand under the glow. The world started calling it the Russian light. For a brief moment, Paris was the brightest city that had ever existed. Across the Atlantic, an American inventor named Charles Brush was building something even more powerful. Brush designed a rugged, reliable arc lighting system, dynamo and lamps together, that could actually survive being used by a real city every night. On the evening of the 29th of April, 1879, Cleveland switched on 12 brush arc lamps in its public square. Thousands of people gathered. A military band played. When the lights came on, the crowd reportedly fell silent and then cheered, and some people were frightened. The light was simply too much. It did not look like fire. It looked like a piece of the sun had been nailed to a pole. The following year, the tiny town of Wabash, Indiana, mounted 4 brush arc lamps on top of its courthouse and lit the entire town from above. Wabash claimed to be the first electrically lighted city on Earth, and visitors traveled from miles around to see it. They described being able to read a newspaper in the street at midnight. They described the strange, hard, shadowless quality of the light, so unlike the warm flicker of gas. This was the beginning of one of the most ambitious ideas in the history of cities, the Moonlight Tower. The thinking went like this. If a single arc lamp was bright enough to light a whole town square, why bother putting small lamps on every street corner? Why not build enormous towers, some of them over 150 feet tall, mount a cluster of brilliant arc lamps at the top, and bathe entire districts in artificial moonlight from above? So they did. Detroit built a vast network of these towers in the 1880s, a forest of iron masts scattered across the city, each one casting a cold pool of light over the neighborhoods below. Other cities followed. The idea was genuinely futuristic. A single artificial moon for thousands of people, and in a few places, those towers still stand today. Austin, Texas bought a set of second-hand moonlight towers in the 1890s, and a handful of them are still lit every night, the last survivors of a vanished idea about how a city should glow. If the story ended there, it would already be remarkable. But the arc light had a dark side, and that dark side is the first clue to why these technologies kept getting torn down. Arc light was, frankly, a monster. It was far too bright and far too harsh for almost any normal human use. You could not put one inside a home. You could not put one inside a shop. The glare was punishing. The light was a cold blue-white that drained the color out of everything, and it cast knife-edge shadows that made people look ghoulish. It was good for one thing only, flooding huge open spaces, and even there it had problems. The carbon rods that produced the arc burned away as they worked. They were being consumed constantly, which meant every single lamp needed a delicate mechanism to keep feeding the rods toward each other at exactly the right speed. When that mechanism slipped, the lamp would sputter, hiss, flicker violently, or simply go out. And the rods had to be physically replaced all the time, often every single day, which meant teams of men climbing those poles and those enormous towers over and over. It got worse. An open electric arc does not just make light. It makes ultraviolet radiation, enough to burn skin and damage eyes over time. It makes ozone, that sharp metallic smell you notice before a thunderstorm, which in quantity is poisonous. The lamps occasionally threw off tiny fragments of burning carbon. They were a fire risk. They were an electrocution risk, running high-voltage current through equipment in the open air, in the rain, accessible to anyone who climbed up to it. People were injured. People were killed. The artificial sun, it turned out, was not safe to live under. What people actually wanted was not a brighter light. It was a gentler one. A light you could bring indoors, a light that would not blind you or poison you or set your curtains on fire, and while the arc lamps were blazing away over the boulevards, a different inventor was obsessing over exactly that problem. His name was Thomas Edison. Edison did not invent the idea of the incandescent bulb. The principle, passing electricity through a thin filament until it glows, had been chased by dozens of experimenters for decades, and in England Joseph Swan developed a working incandescent lamp at almost the same time. But Edison and his team, around 1879, cracked the combination that made it practical. A filament that could glow for hundreds of hours without burning up inside a glass bulb with the air pumped out. The light it gave was soft, warm, steady, and safe enough to sit on a desk or hang in a parlour. More important than the bulb, though, was the system Edison built around it. In September of 1882, he opened the Pearl Street station in Lower Manhattan, a central power plant that generated electricity and pushed it through underground cables to light up the surrounding blocks. This was the real revolution. Not just a lamp, but a grid, a whole network of generation and distribution that could deliver electricity to building after building. Edison had invented, more or less, the electric utility. But Edison's system had a hidden flaw, and that flaw set off the war that would tear the whole young industry apart and rip out a generation of infrastructure in the process. Edison's grid ran on direct current, DC, electricity flowing in one steady direction. And direct current has one crippling weakness: it cannot travel very far. By the time Edison's current pushed through a mile or so of copper cable, it had weakened so much that it was useless. Which meant that to light a city with DC, you needed a power station roughly every mile. A station in every neighborhood, burning coal, with all the cost and smoke and machinery that implied. It worked for a dense, wealthy district like the one around Pearl Street. It did not work for a continent. There was an alternative, and its champion was an industrialist named George Westinghouse, armed with the patents of a strange genius named Nikola Tesla. The alternative was alternating current, AC. Electricity that rapidly reverses direction many times a second. The magic of AC was that using a device called a transformer, you could push it to extremely high voltage for the long journey across the country, then step it back down to a safe, usable level when it arrived. High voltage travels efficiently over huge distances. Suddenly you could build one big power plant and light a city 50 miles away. AC could do what DC simply could not. It could cover a nation. This should have been a straightforward engineering decision. AC transmits farther, so AC wins. But Edison had staked his entire fortune and reputation on direct current. He had factories, patents, and power stations all built around DC, and if AC won, all of it would be worthless overnight. So Edison did not concede. He went to war, and the weapon he chose was fear. Edison launched a campaign to convince the public that alternating current was a killer. His associates funded gruesome public demonstrations in which animals, dogs, horses, and other creatures were electrocuted with AC in front of crowds and reporters, all to prove how lethal Westinghouse's current was. Edison's people pushed pamphlets warning that AC would turn every home into a death trap. The campaign reached its darkest point with the electric chair. When New York State went looking for a more modern method of execution, Edison's camp quietly worked to ensure the chair would run on alternating current, specifically so that the public would forever associate AC with death. They even tried to popularize a verb. To be executed in the chair, they suggested, should be called being Westinghoused. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. In 1890, a convicted murderer named William Kemmler became the first man put to death in the electric chair. The execution was botched and horrifying, and Edison's side tried to use even that as propaganda against his rival. It did not work. The engineering was simply too good to suppress with fear. The decisive moment came at Niagara Falls. In the 1890s, engineers built a massive power plant to harness the falls, and they chose Tesla and Westinghouse's alternating current to do it. In 1896, that plant began sending electricity all the way to the city of Buffalo, more than 20 miles away, something Edison's direct current could never have done. The war was over. Alternating current had won. And here is the first great ripping out. The first time a working technology was torn from the ground, not because it was broken, but because the money moved. All across the country, Edison's direct current systems were now obsolete. Power stations, cables, equipment, an entire first generation of electrical infrastructure, much of it had to be abandoned, scrapped, or expensively rebuilt to run on AC. Even Edison's own company moved on without him. In 1892, Edison General Electric merged with a rival to form a new giant, General Electric, and Edison's name and his beloved direct current were quietly pushed aside. The man who built the first grid lost control of the industry he created. The moonlight towers came down too, in city after city, as alternating current made it cheap and practical to run wires everywhere and hang ordinary incandescent lamps on every corner. The whole logic of the giant tower collapsed. Why light a district from one enormous, dangerous, daily maintained tower when you could simply line the streets with gentle bulbs? The artificial moons were dismantled and sold for scrap. The arc lamp itself, that blinding sun on a pole, faded out of the streets within a couple of decades of its triumph. Not because it stopped working, but because something cheaper and kinder had arrived. So the pattern is already clear, and we are not even at the Mercury lamp yet. A technology appears. It dazzles the world. People build enormous, ambitious infrastructure around it. And then, within 20 or 30 years, the economics shift, a new system wins, and the old one is torn out and forgotten so completely that, a century later, people find a photograph of it and assume it must have been some lost miracle that was deliberately hidden. The forgetting is real. The conspiracy is not. Which finally brings us to the blue lamp. The corpse light, the one at the center of the whole legend. Around 1901, an American inventor named Peter Cooper Hewitt patented a genuinely new kind of lamp. Not a flame, not a glowing wire, but a sealed glass tube containing a small amount of mercury. When electricity passed through the tube, it vaporized the mercury and excited it into giving off light. This was a mercury vapor lamp, and it was one of the ancestors of nearly every fluorescent and discharge lamp that would light the 20th century. Cooper Hewitt's lamp had one genuinely impressive quality. It was efficient. For the amount of electricity it consumed, it produced far more light than the incandescent bulbs of its day. In an age when electricity was expensive, that mattered enormously. But it had a flaw that no amount of efficiency could fix. The light it produced was hideous. Mercury vapor glows in a narrow band of the spectrum, heavy on blue and green, with essentially no red in it at all. And red is the color of human blood, of lips, of healthy skin. Under a Cooper Hewitt lamp, red simply vanished. Lips turned black. Faces turned a sickly greenish white. Everyone looked like a drowned body, a cadaver laid out on a table. People found it deeply unsettling to stand in. You could not put a lamp like that in a restaurant or a parlor or a shop. It made the customers look like the dead. So the mercury lamp never became the street lamp of the people. Instead, it found work in places where its ghastly color did not matter, and its efficiency did. Factories. Drafting rooms where engineers needed bright, even light to read their plans. And, strangely, photography. The early film and photographic plates of that era happened to be most sensitive to exactly the blue and green light the mercury lamp produced, so photographers loved it. The corpse light became, of all things, a tool for making pictures. Now look closely at what this lamp actually was, because this is where the myth lives or dies. The Cooper Hewitt mercury lamp could not, under any circumstances, power itself. It was a discharge tube. It required a steady supply of external electricity to do anything at all. The early versions were so dependent on their power source that you often had to physically tilt the tube to get the mercury to bridge the contacts and start the arc. Without being plugged into a generator or a grid, a mercury vapor lamp is just a cold glass tube with a puddle of poison metal in the bottom. It is dark, it is dead, it does nothing. So where does the legend come from? Why do thousands of people online believe these lamps ran on free energy pulled from the atmosphere, and that the technology was buried by 1907 to protect the profits of the power companies? The legend grows out of a worldview that has spread widely in recent years, often gathered under the name Tartaria. The core idea is that there was once a lost, advanced global civilization, far more sophisticated than we are told, whose works were erased from history and reattributed to lesser builders. Believers point to grand old buildings, ornate architecture, and forgotten machines as the leftovers of this hidden golden age. And free, wireless energy is one of the great themes of that worldview, partly because of real history. Nikola Tesla genuinely did dream of transmitting power without wires, and genuinely did fail to make it practical. That real, documented failure gets stretched into a story about a working free energy world that was deliberately suppressed. The mercury lamp is perfect raw material for that story. It is old. It glows an eerie, otherworldly blue that does not look like ordinary electric light. Its history really was forgotten by almost everyone. And mercury itself carries a whiff of alchemy and mystery. Take a genuine antique photograph of a Cooper Hewitt installation or an old arc lamp, strip away the real context, add a confident caption claiming it needed no power source, and you have manufactured a miracle. Most people sharing it have no way to know that the strange tube in the picture was, in reality, bolted to a very ordinary electrical supply. And then there is the deepest reason the simplest version cannot be true, the one that no caption can argue its way around. A lamp that powers itself forever, taking in nothing and giving out light, is a perpetual motion machine. It would be creating energy out of nothing. And as far as everything we have ever measured about the universe tells us, energy cannot be created out of nothing. It can only be moved or converted from one form to another. This is not a rule invented by a power company to protect its profits. It is one of the most thoroughly tested principles in all of physics, and not a single working exception has ever been found, despite centuries of people desperately trying. A street lamp burning free forever would not just be a great invention. It would overturn the entire foundation of physics. The far more likely explanation is the boring one. It was plugged in. So no, the self-powering Mercury street lamp was not real, and it was not replaced by 1907. In fact, in 1907 the Mercury lamp was brand new, barely 6 years old, and only beginning its long career. It was not being buried. It was getting started. But do not feel cheated, because something real was lost, and the real loss is the more haunting story. What actually happened is that good technologies, working technologies, were torn out of the world over and over because of money, patents, and corporate war. Edison's direct current grid was real, and it was largely scrapped. The moonlight towers were real, and most of them were demolished. The Yablochkov candles that made Paris the brightest city on earth were real, and they vanished within a few years. An entire first generation of public electric light was built, marvelled at, and then ripped out and replaced, not once but repeatedly, in the span of a single human lifetime. The men and women who watched Cleveland's public square light up in 1879 lived to see that entire technology come and go, and the mercury lamp itself, its story did not end in 1907. It was just paused. Engineers spent decades wrestling with its ugly colour. The breakthrough came when they coated the inside of the tube with a phosphor, a chemical that absorbs the lamp's harsh ultraviolet output and re-emits it as soft, usable white light. That coated mercury tube is the fluorescent lamp, and when it arrived commercially in the late 1930s, it went on to light half the offices, schools, and factories of the 20th century. The corpse light, tamed at last, conquered the world after all. Later, high-pressure versions of the mercury lamp finally did become real street lamps, casting their blue-white glow over highways and parking lots for decades, until they in turn were replaced by the orange sodium lamps, which were themselves replaced by the white LEDs you see overhead tonight. So the pattern never actually stopped. We are still doing it. The light above your street right now is just the latest lamp in a chain of torn-out, scrapped, forgotten technologies, stretching back to a man with a giant battery in 1808. Every one of those lamps felt permanent to the people standing under it. Every one of them was replaced. That, in the end, is what the legend gets right by accident. It senses that something was lost. It feels the strangeness of those old blue lamps and the silence where their history should be, and it reaches for an explanation. The explanation it reaches for, hidden free energy and a grand conspiracy, is false. But the underlying feeling is correct. We really did build wonders and tear them down. We really did forget. The truth is simply that no one had to suppress this history to make it disappear. We let it vanish all on our own, the way we always do, the moment something cheaper came along. The lamps did not power themselves. They never could. But the men who built them and fought over them and scrapped them were chasing something just as remarkable as free energy. They were trying to abolish the night. And against every expectation, in a single rush of decades full of blinding suns and corpse-blue tubes and electrocuted animals and ruined fortunes, they very nearly did. Look up the next time you walk home in the dark. That ordinary light over your head is the survivor of a war you were never taught about. And one day, sooner than you think, it too will be ripped out, scrapped and forgotten, just like all the ones that came before it.